This morning, what I'd like for you to do is, if you've got a bulletin and you're a note taker and you like to be kind of caught up with everything going on, or there's things you like to remember, just want you to write down a couple of things. Write 2 Samuel, chapter 3, and chapter 11 and 12. And underneath that, write Luke, beginning and end. And you can find it other places too, but I'm going to just tell you some stories today, and I thought if you'd like to go back and reread them, that would be helpful. So, just to kind of bring you back into what we're doing, our sermon series is The Walking Wounded, and how is it that people who have hope in Jesus Christ, how is it that people who believe they will be made whole by Jesus Christ, how do they walk through life, and what is that? What does that look like? And how do we, as people who are not yet whole, when we see someone else who is broken, how do we reach out? So today we're going to talk about grief. And when I began to think about grief and began to prepare the message for today, the first word that popped into my mind was Rizpah. Can you say Rizpah for me? Say Rizpah. Rizpah is the name of a woman in the Bible. You might think, wow, Rizpah, does that mean grief? How incredibly fortuitous would that be, Pastor, that you were researching grief in the Bible and you found a woman whose name was grief? Actually, no, her name doesn't mean grief. It does mean a hot stone used for baking, but I'm not quite sure how that ties in. I can't really forcibly shove that into a grief sermon, but that is her name. It also brings us into a situation where we understand who she is because of who else is in the story with her. Let me back up a little bit. Rizpah was actually a concubine, and we know this, that she wasn't a wife, because in Hebrew there are two different words used, one for wife and one for concubine. So if it's translated concubine, we know for a fact that it was the case. A king or a man who had many wives could take one of his concubines and marry her and make her an actual spouse, but that took a lot of rituals and a lot of different things. Plus, during the time that we are talking about, you actually have a situation where they are bound by Levitical law, the book of Leviticus and the laws in there. They cannot marry more than one woman. So what they would do is they found the loophole. And they said, well, I'm technically not married to these other women, but I will keep them in a tent. And then they are available to me whenever I should call upon them, and we don't need to explain what they were used for, right? We all know what a concubine was used for, right? So this poor woman was at King Saul's beck and call, and concubine, or the word in Hebrew that is translated concubine, literally means in English a mistress who lives in the house. A mistress who lives in the house. So Rizpah, woman whose name means hot baking stone for bread or whatever, her name literally means that, and her title was mistress who lives in the house. Okay, well, King Saul didn't last an incredibly long time, and there was another man who took his place. Do you remember who took King Saul's place? He was a shepherd boy, and he beat a giant. David. Saul was the first king. David was the one that took his place. He didn't really usurp, but he was kind of given the blessing from Samuel. God kind of chose it because Saul made some mistakes, and so David was king. So that's King David. The highlight of Jewish monarchy, King David. David is king. That's a pretty good time. So the Gideonites one day, the Gideons, different from what we have today when you see a Gideon or you see a Bible in a hotel. The Gideonites came up to King David, and they said, David, we've got a problem. And David said, well, what can I help you with? They said, well, we need revenge. He says, oh my goodness, why do you need revenge? He says, we need revenge because King Saul murdered members of our family, and many of our young men were slaughtered under his hand. And David said, well, that's horrible. How can I help you? And they said, well, we want you to go and murder his sons. And David said, well, oh my, that's kind of harsh. And they said, we know it is. That's why it's called revenge. That's not in there. I just added that. And so David says, okay, well, I will do that. So David hunts down, Saul's sons, which includes the ones by concubines. Those were still sons of the king. In fact, a concubine of a king was so special that in 2 Samuel, right around chapter 3, we find that a man by the name of Abner goes and visits Rizpah, and there's this huge problem with that because no other man is supposed to visit the concubine of the king because that's an act of trying to take the throne. I know, it's crazy stuff. So anyway, she was very important. So her sons are actually heirs, kind of heirs to the king, but we'd have a long discussion about that. So let's not have that discussion, but they're important. So David kills them. And they are put up on pikes, big sticks, almost like crosses. They are murdered. They are put up on those things so that their bodies would decay, so that dishonor would fall upon the house of Saul, and the Gideonites would be happy, and David could have some peace and quiet. That is until Rizpah decided what she was going to do. Because whatever you want to call her, whatever names you want to call her, whatever things you want to think about her function in that household of the king, she was still a mom, and she grieved. She grieved so hard that she came to the place where her sons were hanging, and she found a large rock, and she spread a blanket on it and sat on it and wept. And she wept not for an hour, not for a day, not for a week, but longer. She wept for so long that word reached back to King David, and that said, "This woman whose sons you have taken from her refuses to allow their bodies to be corrupted by the birds of the air and the things that usually, take care of such things." And there she weeps. And David was so overcome with pity that he changed his mind, and he ordered that they be taken down and buried in the royal tomb. So those sons of Saul would be laid to rest, and that mother, whose heart was broken, could leave the field where her sons were hanging. So the boys were killed, and eventually they were put in a tomb. If you go on to chapter 11 into 12, this same David has not one of his brighter moments. And it involves a beautiful woman by the name of Bathsheba. You remember the story of David and Bathsheba? She's sunning herself on the rooftop, and he sees her, and he's like, "She is hot. And she must be my wife." The only problem was she was already married, right? Remember the name of her husband, Uriah? And Uriah was the captain in David's army. And so what did he do? Did David have him killed? Not technically, but what he did was he put him in the front lines where all of the slaughter during the skirmishes and the battle would happen. So he was almost guaranteed. And of course Uriah died, and then David took Bathsheba for himself. And there's an issue with the prophet Nathan. So Nathan comes in and kind of accuses David of what he's done, and David repents. And so David thinks, well, this is it. I'm fine, and everything is cool with me and God. Unfortunately, it wasn't. Bathsheba, from that interlude with David, the affair that they had, gives birth to a son, and that son begins to become ill. He begins to be sick. And David, he just freaks out. And he stops eating. He prays without ceasing. He won't talk. He won't sleep. He just completely is invested in trying to petition God for this child's life. Now, regardless of your theology of whether or not you think God is punishing David for his sins, or you think that this is just happenstance because of the situation, because of a very low mortality rate back in that time period, it really doesn't matter. What matters is the king, the most powerful man in that part of the world, lost his son. This child died. Now the story goes that once they told him that the child had died, he got up, got cleaned up, and ate. And they couldn't believe that. They said, "You're not behaving correctly, David. I know you're the king and everything, but why is it that you freaked out and prayed and wept and grieved? Why did you grieve while your child was just sick? And now that he is dead, why is it that you're just going now beyond your business?" It's almost as like that story is there when you put it against the story of Rizpah. It's there for us as human beings to understand that not any of us are going to grieve in the same way. None of us are going to grieve the same way. And, from king to concubine, we're all affected by grief. David, just like Rizpah, had to put his son into the royal tomb and say goodbye. So there's another story with a tomb. There's another story, though, about King David and his line, and that brings us into the Gospels. That brings us into the New Testament. It brings us into the time period marked by the Gospel of Luke and some of the other Gospels as well. The time period, of course, there's another king, and his name's Herod. And Herod hears the prophecy that a Messiah is being born or has been born because of the star in the sky. And that king would be born in the lineage of King David. And so, Herod does what? He throws a party. He says, "Hey, welcome to the world, little king," right? No. He puts out a decree that says any male child, any Jewish male child, Roman children were fine, any Jewish male child from certain age to certain age The soldiers would go door to door and murder them. I don't know how. I don't know how gruesome it was. It was obviously very gruesome. I don't know if they did it there in the house or they drug them into the streets crying and screaming while parents came out crying and screaming. I don't know, but I know it was horrible. The technical term for this story in the Bible is called the massacre or the slaughter of the innocents. And after all those children were murdered, after all those children were slain, all those families had to have funerals. And they had to put those children in tombs. And they grieved. The odd thing was, the one who was supposed to be murdered while he was a child escaped. They fled to Egypt. Remember the story? They fled to Egypt, which is kind of weird because Egypt was this touchstone for where everything was happening from slavery, and Moses brought him out of Egypt, and Jesus was given sanctuary in Egypt and protected. Well, he left Egypt. He went to Nazareth, and he was there for about 33 years. And during those last 3 years, we know what he did because it's the basis for our entire Christian faith. What he said and what he did those 3 years are all what we follow. And of course, we're talking about Jesus Christ. We're talking about Jesus of Nazareth. We're talking about Jesus, son of David. And this David's son, in a way, was arrested one night as he was having supper with his disciples. They went out to pray, and he was captured in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was brought before Pilate. And remember the story about Pilate? Pilate's there, and he's looking, and he says, okay, well, we'll just deal with this. What's wrong with this guy? And the Sanhedrin, who was the court that had already tried and just kind of made a mockery of the whole legal proceedings and just completely railroaded the whole thing and made sure that Jesus was going to be guilty, brought him to Pilate and said, well, we want to do this to him, but we're not allowed to kill, so we would like you to do it for us. It's against our religion to kill, so would you please kill him for us? And Pilate's like, well, whatever, I don't really get it. And they said, well, he was a rabble-rouser, and he's going to make things difficult if you let him go. And you know how Pilate, you love law and order here in Jerusalem when there's lots of people. And Pilate thinks, well, you're right, I really do. He goes through the process, has conversations. The hilarious thing, that's not hilarious, it's actually very tragic, but he's looking at Jesus, and remember the question Pilate asks Jesus? What is it? What is truth? I was a philosophy major, and I'd have been really excited to answer that, and it would have taken a few days to get to the answer. What is truth, Pilate? I don't know. As we look to, But Jesus is there before him, and Pilate says, what is truth? Do you know why that's funny? Jesus said what about himself? I am the way and the... Oh, Jesus says, I am the truth. Not the embodiment of some odd Greek definition. Jesus Christ said, I am the truth. I am the truth. Pilate, what is truth? Jesus says elsewhere, I am. When Moses is dealing with his stuff and he's been told to go in to try and get the people to be let go, he has this problem and he doesn't understand exactly how he's supposed to convey this message. He stutters and he's kind of terrified about that, and he turns to God and he says, well, who am I supposed to say has sent me? It's not exactly like you gave me your business card, Lord, and I can just say, well, yes, this guy named God has sent me. And God says in Hebrew, Ayesh Asher Ayesh, and it means I am that I am. Tell them the great I am sent you. The name of God is I am. Pilate says, what is truth? Jesus said, what? What's the first part? I am the truth. Christ is not just the son of David, he is the son of God. So there's no way that this story is going to end in tragedy. There's no way that there's going to be a slaughter of the innocent. There's no way that this is going to be Mary's son whom she loved and whom she trusted God to deliver into this world. There's no way this is going to end in tragedy, and yet that's exactly what happens. He is led off. He is crucified like a criminal between two thieves. He bleeds. Remember what killed him? As they stabbed him, blood and water flowed. Remember that image? Blood and water flowed. Well, if you were piercing his side and blood and water flowed, that meant congestive heart failure. So in a poetic way, it means that Christ died of a broken heart. He gave his heart, he gave his life for us on the cross. And that scene as we see it, many different artists have depicted it many different ways, and different gospels tell the story different ways, but in all of them there is a gathering at the foot of the cross, isn't there? And who's there? His mom, his aunt, his friends. He even has this moment where he tells one of the disciples, he says to his disciple, he says, "Friend, see your mother, mother, see your son." Basically handing off to say, I'm not going to make this. I'm going to die. I am going to be gone. That tragedy of that moment, the heartbreak of that moment, the grief of that moment is not passed over for Mary because she was a good person and she did what God asked. She has to watch her son die. Her son that she knew was the Son of God. Can you imagine that? To know in your heart and your mind that this is the Son of God, this is the one that shouldn't be able to be harmed, and yet she can barely recognize him because of the beating he took by the Roman soldiers, and there she is grieving, and he dies, and she enters into that deep sorrow. So do the other women. The Son of God, the Son of David, is taken down from the cross. And like all the other stories I've shared this morning, where is he laid? They put him in what? A tomb. They put him in a tomb. And people grieve. People weep. The door, the stone is rolled in front so that no one can open it. And fast forward into Sunday. We are in the season of Easter, so even though you look kind of sorrowful right now, I hope you remember exactly how this ends, and it is that it is not an ending, it is a beginning. And according to the Gospel of John, some might think this is a bit of a stretch, but I think it's one of the coolest things that I've read recently. In the Gospel of John, some scholars believe that the disciple in whom Jesus loved was not, in this case, John, but it was the name of someone over whom Jesus wept. Do you remember in Scripture, the shortest verse Jesus wept? Who dies that Jesus cries over? Do you remember? Lazarus. Lazarus. Some traditions hold that one of the first men to the tomb to look in to see was the one whom Jesus rescued from the tomb, Lazarus. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that poetic? And he's not here. He's risen. Depending on which translation you look at, depending on which version you look at, someone says to someone, he is not here, he is risen. And the grief and the terror and the fear begins to shift. Because up until this point, people only knew how to grieve in a closed tomb. Up until this point, people only knew that when someone went into the tomb, they stayed there forever. Obviously, not Lazarus, right? Kind of an exception there. I fooled you. But in this moment, history changes forever because Mary does not have to sit on a stone at the foot of the cross and hope that his body is not taken by vultures, or sit vigil or do this. He is lovingly placed into a tomb. In fact, a brand new tomb from Joseph of Arimathea that's not quite completely finished yet. And Christ is risen. He shows himself in many different ways to many different people. There are other stories that come off this, but I'm going to wrap this portion for today up about grief. These four things that I've shared with you are incredibly important, but the last one is the most important. Because the last one embodies your decision on how you will grieve. Will you grieve as someone who believes the tombs are closed and there is no hope and death is the end? Will you grieve as a mother who has lost a child and just simply sit vigil in front of where the tragedy took place? Or like David, will you put the loved one in the tomb and walk away trying to figure out how to put your life back together? How will you grieve? Will you grieve as the victims of tragedy and the slaughter of the innocents? Will you grieve as the mother of Jesus who saw her son die? Or will you grieve as someone who knows that death is not the end? Because there you have a different option, don't you? There you have sadness, you have heartache, you have tears, you have anger, you have resentment, you have all those things. But you have all those things, but with the knowledge that the tomb is open. You have knowledge that death is not the end. You have knowledge that that one forsaken tomb completely changes everything. So as we, the walking wounded, as we walk with one another, as our hearts are filled with heartache, as they are broken, as we are trying to figure out how everything fits together, we do so with the hope with the hope that all has been taken care of. So this morning, many of us are still grieving. Many of us have lost loved ones in the last few months. Many of us are worried about loved ones who are ill. Many of us are grieving over things in life that have shifted, drastically shifted. Plans that we thought were going to happen have not, and it has just whiplashed us into a what is going on, God, because that's grief too. A life path that changes can cause grief. But how will you grieve? Will you grieve as someone who has no hope? Or will you grieve as someone who knows that hope is the only thing that matters? And what does that look like in your life? What does that look like such that every decision that you make, every relationship that you have, that Christ is not in the tomb? Because it can define everything for us. And we can come out stronger. We can come out stronger because the suffering that we go through when we grieve can be healthy. It can be a way for us to process. It can be a way for us to band together with people and learn to lean on one another. It's not good, it's tragic, and it is horrible to lose a loved one. But Christ can be a part of our lives in such a way that something good can come of it. Remember Rizpah? Rizpah from the beginning of this sermon, this story. Rizpah, whose name meant a baking stone. It's also a word that can be translated coal. Coal. What happens when coal is put under incredible circumstance of heat and pressure? What does a coal piece turn into? A diamond. A diamond. We are jewels for Christ. And although our pain is evident as we grieve, we are taught by Scripture that the strength of God, the strength of Christ within us is made perfect in our strength, right? No. His strength is made perfect in our weakness. So let us choose to be weak. Let us choose to weep. Let us choose to be in sorrow. But let us never choose to forsake hope. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.